I just moved into a new office, and outside the door, there's a Sundance Film Festival poster, and on it says, "Art makes the silent speak." And I pass it every day, and a lot of times each day, and each time I read it, I'm like, yeah, that's right, yeah, that's right. And it seems really appropriate, because that's what we're doing here tonight. I remember when I was 7 or 8, I was walking home from school, and I grew up in a city called Downey, Southern California. Anyway, the sidewalk was crammed with kids, and Mr. Zufall, the principal, was out there making sure we were going to get off school property safely. And the school was on the right side, and across the street was a row of houses, and I remember hearing glass break and screaming. And all of a sudden I saw a woman tumble backwards outside the screen door, landing on the floor, and the man followed her, and he grabbed her by the hair and he pulled her into the house and slammed the door. And I remember standing there thinking, it happens everywhere, it's normal. This is what happens in everyone's houses, only no one talks about it. And immediately my mind went to my mom, because the biggest fear in my life was that I would come home one day and I'd find her dead. So I started crying, and I sprinted. I ran as fast as I could. I ran home, and I got there, and my mom, she saw me, and her face lit up, but she also was concerned because I was crying. I was out of breath, and she scooped me up, and she used to call me her teensy weensy, and she said, "My teensy weensy, what's wrong with you?" And all I could do was cry, and I didn't tell her why I was crying. I was just really grateful that she was holding me, and I was in her arms, and she was okay. Well, 15 years ago, the biggest fear in my life actually happened. My dad killed my mom, and he killed himself. I have 2 brothers and 2 sisters, and for us it was absolutely devastating, and it was confusing, because it wasn't always bad. We actually had good times. And the thing, though, was that, you never knew what you were going to get with my dad. Sometimes he was happy and he could smile with his eyes, and sometimes he would come home and he'd slam the door, and if it was a door slam when he walked through the door, we knew it was going to be a rough night. And it didn't have to be anything. We used to think that we could be really good or somehow control the outcome of the evening. But he would come home and he would try to pick fights, and inevitably something would happen, and he'd start hitting somebody, and my mom would intervene to rescue us, and the violence would turn to her. And usually what would happen is my older brothers and sisters, since I was the youngest, they'd have me get my favorite doll, which is a cat in the hat, the plastic head and drawstring, and I'd take that and I'd walk down the street. We lived on a cul-de-sac, and I'd sit there and I'd wait for someone to come for me, or I'd wait until I felt it was over. And my oldest brother and my other brother, they would try to stop it. My sister would grab the knives and throw them in the rose bushes, and my other sister would call the police. And so I would wait, and I remember seeing the police cars go by, and I'd think, oh, they're going to come, they're supposed to protect us. And they'd park, and they'd go in the house. In a little while, they'd come out, and they wouldn't take my dad. And I thought, well, maybe they'll take us. And then they'd drive by, and they wouldn't take us. And it went on like that. And I remember, I was little, and sometimes they didn't come get me, so I would have to summon the courage to get up and walk back to the house. And I'd go back home, and I would walk in the door, and I'd hear this sobbing, and I would go in, and the furniture would be knocked over, and I would go, and I'd see my father in the back den, and it was usually dark, and he would just be staring off into space, not staring at anything in particular, and he would just be lost, and there was this darkness, and it was frightening. It was absolutely terrifying. And at that time, usually my mom would call me into the room, and I'd go in, and she'd be crying, but she'd see me, and her face would light up. And she'd hold me, and she'd tell me that it wasn't our fault. And she would say that it was going to be okay. And I'd see her face, and she had bruises on her face. She had black eyes sometimes, and she had bruises on her arms and legs. And that's the way it was. But it wasn't always bad. So we used to have a reprieve sometimes. We'd take family road trips. My parents were from El Paso, Texas. And we had every year we'd go, on these road trips, and it was the one time that nothing happened. It was the one time that we actually had a reprieve from the violence at home. And I don't know why that was, but actually the road was safer than home. And so we'd all pile of it into this Volkswagen camper van with wood paneling, and it was really a cool van. And the 3 last letters on the license plate read A-OK. So I had this sort of confidence that anytime I was in that van, it was going to be A-OK. And really it was. It was, you know, my father would get that smile. He smiled with his eyes, and my mom, she could sing, and she didn't sing very well, actually. But she'd sing at the top of her lungs. She'd sing with her heart, and, you know, America the Beautiful and all of that, and amber waves of grain, and she was so happy. And so it was a time we could tease her and get away with teasing my father. And we'd end up in El Paso. We'd eat the best Mexican food ever because my grandmother and grandfather, they all lived there, aunts and uncles. We'd eat homemade flour tortillas and be in the desert. And when that time ended, it was time to go home. And we'd start to cry. And my relatives always thought, well, it's because they're going to miss us. And really, we were crying because we had to go home, and we knew what we were going home to. And so we all piled back into the van, and we all just wished that they would just keep us there, that they would take us away from it all, but they didn't. They just didn't. So we'd head back home, and slowly but surely my father would transform into this person who I could see was worried, and the smile would go away, and my mother would get quiet and more somber, and it went on like that through my childhood all the way till we grew up, till I moved out. Well, about 3 years ago, my nephew called, and he told me he had to go to anger management. And I said, why do you got to do that? And he said, well, because I got arrested for domestic violence. Well, one of the things after the funeral, my brothers and sisters, we all promised that we were going to stop this in our family, my brothers and sisters, we were going to do whatever it took. And that if we found out that the future generations were repeating the cycle, we'd do something about it. And I thought back to that, and I thought, it's time. I got to do something about this. I don't know what that is, but I got to do something about this. And being a filmmaker, the way that I express myself is through film. So I called my nephew back. I said, you know, I want to do a road trip. I want to go back, and I want to find out more about my mom, your grandma. I want to find out who she was as a woman, not the person who was a victim of domestic violence, but the woman she was. You know, the woman with the adventure and the spirit and the joy who could sing at the top of her lungs. I want to find out who that is, because maybe if we find out more about her, we'll understand. And maybe we'll be able to learn more about your grandpa, my dad, and maybe I'll find some compassion for him, because I don't have that right now. And maybe we'll go and we'll interview other people who are going through this and find out how they're healing and find out what they're doing. And he agreed. So, right, we're going to be going on a road trip this spring, and we're going to interview my mom's friends and family. We're going to get to know her better, and we're going to also meet with other families who are going through this, and also experts, and we're going to ask the question, how do you stop the cycle? Because it's time to make the silence speak.